Hello, all three of you. Thank you so much for being a part of this conversation. I'm super excited to learn about the work that you're doing and your perspectives on this topic as well. Christine, thank you for doing the session pitch for me before. So everyone here, you've just heard a little bit about what we're going to be chatting about. But basically, this session is going to be focused on the question, if dignity is the foundation right for all human beings. However, are all human beings born free and equal when it comes to dignity and rights? And we're going to get into what is a pretty meaty conversation, which I'm looking forward to. Just as a quick note of housekeeping before I jump in and ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves, would love for you to get as involved in this session as you might like to. So if you want to put your thoughts in the chat, any questions, I'll do my best to integrate them and to kind of feed them into the conversation we're going to have. The chat, you can see, just for your benefit, is only visible to this room, so it'll be contained within this conversation. But yeah, please feel free to add questions to the question tab, and you can also upvote questions. So if you second what someone has already asked, please upvote it and I'll know how to prioritise according to where the interest of the group is. All right, Nicola, Catherine, Christine, sorry. I know each of you are passionate about equality, but I would love to get some context for that. So can you give a little bit of an introduction to yourself and why this topic is of such significance to you? Anna, I might jump to you first.
Sure. Hi everyone. My name's Anna Wright, and I'm the CEO of Bindi Maps. So, and this topic is so close to my heart, so I hope I don't talk too much. But Bindi Maps is a smartphone app that helps anybody navigate an unfamiliar internal space. So, like a hospital, a university, or something like that. But now anyone can use it, but we first developed this app for people who are blind and vision impaired, and then we took it out to people who are using wheelchairs, or we're just working now on people on the autism spectrum, because it is so unfair. If you're blind or vision impaired, you just can't independently access things like hospitals. And for me, most important, my background is in education, but tertiary education. For somebody with a disability, you're 60% more likely to have a full-time job if you have a tertiary education. So that takes you off welfare and into contributing and creating and all of those things. And personally, I hate the word disability, because I think that's just, I'd say, look, people are people, and some people just can't see. But why? They can still study, they're still clever, they can still contribute. So yeah, sorry, I just get really, when you said about equality around places, I'm like, I hate it when we exclude, and not on purpose, we just don't understand. And we don't have the experience. So that's why panels like this are so important.
And just before I jump to one of our other panelists, can I ask, where did the insight come from that this was missing in action to begin with?
Well, it's quite a long time ago for me. I was diagnosed with a very rare retinal condition that eventually I will go completely blind, so not even any light sensitivity. So I've been preparing for that for a long, long time now. And I'm quite unusual in that my sight hasn't deteriorated as fast as it should have. But when you do start to learn all the things you can do and you can't do, my question to everyone is, when you do see a Braille sign in public, like on a loo or something like that, as much as we love Braille signs, ask yourself that if you were blind, how would you find that Braille sign? Like, how do you even know that it's there? So in a way, it's a gesture. And I think everybody who's vision impaired is appreciative of any help, but it's not really that helpful. So it was just, how can we solve this? And now we've got technology, and we should be using tech for good.
Love that. Tech for good, a big part of the kind of, I think, through lines that are running through the whole of this afternoon's sessions, which is great. Nicola, I want to come to you next. You've got two taglines next to your name, both Period Revolution and the GoGo Foundation. Tell us a little bit about yourself and why this topic matters to you.
Thank you so much. And I just want to honour you, Anna. I didn't know that part of your origin story, and it's very moving. So thank you for the incredible work that you're doing. And also, I'll just say I am at the whim of my womb, and I'm feeling emotional today. So it's really nice to be such a heartfelt conversation. From For those of you that know Sarah Gunn, I'm sure most of you do. She's the CEO and founder of GoGo Events and GoGo Foundation. I've been lucky enough to be able to work with her on these incredible projects. So GoGo is really focused on creating employment for those that face really complex barriers to achieving employment, primarily women, especially those that have experienced homelessness. So that's the bulk of the work that we do, and Sarah is a total trailblazer in this space. So I'm very lucky to be working alongside her. We've just launched a new project called Period Revolution. Please check us out. Our website is brand new. At the moment, we're collecting stories of your anything to do about your menstrual experiences or how you'd like to change things for the future. So I'm very, very interested, obviously, in gender equity. I see menstrual and period positivity as a gateway to really opening up gender equity. And also, as a proud gay woman, I'm really excited to be part of this conversation because, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but the way that we can help people to belong, not just feel included, is, I think, really central to the evolution of our society and where we go as a human race. So, yeah, I'll leave it there for now.
The distinction between belonging and inclusion. And it strikes me, Anna, you were talking almost about I hate to use this term and I do not mean it in terms of a play on words, but the blind spot in people not really being aware of things like, for example, the silly nature of putting a braille sign somewhere where you've got no ability for a vision impaired person to actually find it and be able to use that as a source of information. Nicola, what it strikes me that you're talking about is a really stigmatized conversation. So a different challenge to getting the level of awareness and the conversation that we need to be having kind of up and running. I'd be interested for your thoughts on the challenge of breaking through a conversation a lot of people don't want to have.
Yeah. Do you want me to share on that now?
Please, yeah. I'd love your thoughts.
Yeah. It's really interesting. It's fascinating, actually, the conversations that have come up. And I'll just share an example of stigma that we face. So as we were getting ready to launch, I opened a Twitter account and I just I'm a bit of a noob when it comes to Twitter. So I just put an initial post on there expecting nobody to see it. But it turned out that there were 20 negative comments on it when I came back to it because if I'd used the word menstruator. So there's a lot of stigma around menstruation to begin with. So it's sort of like inflammatory right from the get-go. But also we'd use that word to be inclusive of everybody, of gender non-binary people, of trans women, so that we were really opening up the language. And the feedback was like, you're succumbing to the patriarchy. I don't bleed. That doesn't relate to me. My dog has a period. Do you want to hear that story? So we've decided Twitter is not the place for the kind of conversations we want to be having.
Life lesson. Twitter's probably not the place for many conversations that are of deep.
Right. Right. But a good way to know what's actually happening in the broader landscape, and because in our worlds we're really surrounded by very open-minded, loving, supportive people who want to learn and grow, but that's not the case for a lot of the world. So I think it's important to keep your finger on the pulse there, but certainly we are keeping a record of these experiences of stigma and taboo because that sort of shapes our pathway.
Yeah, I can bet. Absolutely. Christine, I want to come to you. Can you tell us a little bit about your story and why it is this conversation's of significance for you?
Thanks very much, Holly. And like my other panelists, this conversation is very near and dear and very personal to myself. So I am an African woman born in the teapot country of Zimbabwe. I have always wanted to travel the world. I grew up, with quite what I consider, in my view, a privileged childhood in the sense that, I have nothing but happy memories of my childhood. And a lot of that childhood was spent in a minority. And a lot of people, me being in the minority. So I went to a school where I was one of a handful of African children that were in that school environment, but we never felt excluded. So my early experience around the topics that I'm working on right now was really, really positive. So what that instilled in me was a sense of understanding and compassion that, human beings at their core are really, really good people. There's a handful of people out there who try to make you feel bad about yourself. And unfortunately, the handful of those people get amplified stages. They get amplified stages in that sometimes they become world leaders and they go and they dominate and they colonize countries that we have come from. But when you're talking about the everyday, ordinary person, they are not going out of their way to make you feel bad about yourself. But what's unfortunate is the systems that we now live in and the modern societies that we are now a part of, even the corporate environments that a lot of us work in, are now entrenched with a lot of those beliefs of those people who have gotten hold of the systems of power. So they control those axes of power. So for me, how I started on this journey that I'm on now is it was just a question for me. Why are there not more people like me that are leading organizations that are changing the world? I live in Australia, and it's no secret that the air is very thin in terms of diversity from a cultural point of view, be it a physical point of view, be it whatever indicator you want to pick, the people who make decisions. I worked for a long time for the Queensland government. I worked a lot in the not-for-profit space. What always used to fascinate me is people were making life-changing decisions over a group of people that they had very limited understanding of. If you look at the decision makers in a lot of our large not-for-profit organizations, for example, just as an example, that administer things like our child protection system, domestic and violence, a lot of those. If you look at the statistics of the people that are receiving a lot of those services, and then you look at the demographic makeup of the people that are designing the programs, that are designing the organizations that are driving supposedly the inclusive solutions for these people, there's no diversity there. So how do you then have an affiliation? How do you then have an understanding of, is the solution you're putting up really addressing the problem? How do you empathize? How do you get that need? So that's kind of where my work started, just questioning that to say, well, if the structures are being run by, a fairly homogenous group, but the recipients of the service, be it in an employment capacity, be in a customer service, is so diverse. How then can you get true inclusion in either the employment service or the employment culture or in the service that's being delivered? And the answer when you delve down is you don't. And so we're not going to change the structures of power overnight. We're not. But you can educate, you can raise consciousness, you can raise awareness. And so that's really what I'm passionate about.
Christine, if I can ask a follow-up, one of the things I find interesting when I talk to people who are working at the forefront of issues like yours on diversity and inclusion, they're champions for the cause, is where they sit on the spectrum of optimism to kind of cynicism or just frustration or apathy, depending on where you want to draw your spectrum to. Where do you sit? Do you feel a sense of momentum? Do you feel we're making progress, or are you deeply frustrated that you feel like we're sitting still and that's part of why you're agitating? I'd love your thought.
I think for me, what's really interesting is this is such an obvious thing. Why is it so hard for us to get the momentum? I think that's where some of my apathy comes in. It's we're having this conversation in corridors. If you go online any given day, my inbox is bombarded with articles. I've subscribed to so many things like, there is so much talk and so much noise around it. But when you dig down and see how is that noise translating into real systemic change. So for example, I'm passionate about changing the corporate workplace because I believe if you can change the economic empowerment of a minority group, you change their story. That's my firm belief, and that's where my focus is. And we spend the majority of our time in that workplace. We spend more time sometimes with our work colleagues than we do with our own families. And so how do you influence change in that space? And why is it taking so long? So to answer your question, where am I on that trajectory? I think it depends on the environment that I'm in and on the day. Because, there's some days where I'm super, super excited, super positive, I'm charged. And then there's some days where I'm like, oh, are you serious? Because somebody would have, I'd have walked in and, I went to an event where they were catering for Muslim women. I've worked a lot with the Muslim community, and there was no halal meat in terms of the catering, just something as basic and as simple as that you can do. So these poor women weren't able to eat, and they kept asking. And I'm like, but you kind of knew. So it's that level of lack of sensitivity in simple little everyday gestures and simple little everyday things that we take for granted ourselves when you're not in a minority, and you don't stop to think, well, I've got this group of people. How do I make them feel included? How did I make them feel welcome?
Absolutely. It's interesting. I'm just going to encourage everyone. I've got 45 phenomenal participants in this conversation. Would love to hear the questions that you've got for our fantastic panelists. While we wait for those to pop up, and Kim McDonald, thank you for kicking off with some comments in the question area that are getting some thumbs up, which is great. I wanted to ask each of you, where do you see leadership on your particular issue being done well? And what I guess typifies that leadership? What are some characteristics or traits or examples? Because I think it is always good to find points of light and celebrate them. But also, what do you think is the thing we need to focus on? If we're kind of looking at what's the bit of the problem we can tackle tomorrow, where can our viewers and participants be focusing their effort and energy? Nicola, I might come to you first on this one.
Yeah, sure. I think both the aspects that are really something to look up to as also part of the solution for what we do tomorrow as individuals. And I think it's really bringing your whole self to leadership. That's really what makes the difference. I think in a diversity and equity space, in the menstrual health space, it's not pretending that we're robots, that we don't have anything else going on in our lives, and we don't have feelings, we're not connected to other people. So I think it's a sense of connection to the bigger picture, and really reading that when you're interacting with people, taking a step back and seeing what's all of the context that's happening here that I can see. Because very often I think people react and make decisions from, it's like they're making a decision from outside the front of their brain. So I'm really interested in somatic intuition, I guess. But rather than being really centered and coming from your heart space or even your womb space to act, to be in the world, it's like this, I guess, ego-driven decision-making and leadership. And I think the future really relies on us being in our body for people in positions of leadership, but also just on an individual level. I think it's come back from everything that's out here and land in our bodies and find the wisdom there. I think, ironically, that's the connection to everything else. So it's like if we can take a beat and come back in, then we can recognize all of the interconnectedness. And to me, that's hands down, that's the key to leadership, and that's what I really enjoy in seeing in other people.
Yeah, fantastic. And I think it's such an interesting observation too about how often there is a disconnect between head and heart, and how powerful it is in terms of the X factor that you feel you're in the presence of when you witness a leader who's leading with those two in lockstep with one another.
Absolutely.
It's a really powerful thing. Christine, I'm going to come to you next. What's your thoughts on who's doing this well in your space, and what do we need to be focusing on?
I might start with the second question. What do we need to be focusing on? I think we just need to be focusing on that this is not hard. I think what happens, and this is not a conversation. And what I mean by that is we're talking a lot. There's a lot of talk about inclusive workplaces. There's a lot of talk about we need to hire the head of diversity, and then you hire them, but you have no idea what it is that they're doing within your organization. This is not hard. Let's start at the basics. So for leaders in organizations, ask your people within your organization. You've got a plethora of diversity within your workplace. You've got a plethora of diversity within the people that you're leading. Too often, we're not asking the right question of the people that are within our close proximity. We're running off and thinking we're going to get a solution from some Harvard Business Review or some paper or somebody who's doing it exceptionally well. If you internally focus on your environment, I was raised by my mother to believe charity begins at home. I cannot go out there and be charitable and be kind if the workplace that I am in doesn't edify that. So I think charity definitely does begin at home. And for those leaders that are doing it really, really well, they're leaders that have taken a look at their organization first. They've taken a look at how they're showing up. They've taken a look at, okay, so fine, at the moment, I don't have a lot of diversity in my board, but what is the different ways that I can allow employees to have a platform to be able to contribute to the different strategies, the different ideas that are driving company direction, that are driving HR policy, which directly impacts them. I know, for example, I'll give you a very small example by what I mean by that. There was a massive outcry around domestic and family violence and the impacts that it has. And there was, in those conversations, there were, connotations that certain cultures, it was more apparent in those certain cultures. When you actually speak to people in those communities and you get to know and you get to understand, there is no community that condones violence. None at all. Get to understand that community and how it operates. And then also get to understand how your internal policy might inadvertently be excluding those people from participating. And what I mean by that is that I raised my sister's daughter. I've had her since I was 13 years old. And so for all intents and purposes, she is my niece, according to the Western society's definition of family. But according to my family's definition of family, she's my daughter. And I have parental responsibilities for her, just like my son. So if I'm in a workplace that affords my son a different set of privileges because he is my biological son, but doesn't award those in the case of my niece, then you've excluded me. You haven't included me in that policy. And so a simple understanding of something as basic as that can get an organization to be more inclusive of the people that actually work for them by actually understanding, well, what does family look like for you? What does it mean for you?
Absolutely. And I think that's such a powerful note too, of that notion of looking inward before we look outward, and also not diminishing the significance of our own agency and the choices that we make and the spheres and circles that we operate within. It's such an important reminder. Anna, I'm going to come to you, and I just want to acknowledge as well, thank you for all these questions that are coming through. We're going to throw them in a second, so keep them coming. Anna, what about yourself?
Well, I agree with what Nicola and Christine have said, especially around it's not hard. But I always think about a place, like Christine was saying, about belonging, that we want to make our places not just inclusive, but that everybody feels truly welcome to bring their whole selves to work. So we fight for that with Bindi Maps, but we quite often get the pushback of what are the economics. So how many blind people are there anyway? That I hear that so many times, but what I throw to when I'm asked that is that probably most of you would know, but the original Senate building in the old Parliament House didn't have a female bathroom. It was only a male bathroom there. And I sort of think back to those conversations, like what were those conversations? How many women will want to be senators anyway? Is that what it was? But it doesn't create belonging. It just means you're excluded from a functional point of view. So I think the people that are doing things well are those ones that aren't holding the economics up. They're saying this is easy, we can do it, we can talk to people, we can do inclusion. And those that aren't doing it so well, they're the ones that are counting the pennies and seeing whether or not it's worthwhile to do anything. And then equally, if we want to take it even a little bit further with what Nicola was sort of saying, is that I've also had the conversations of, well, they're sort of implying that having people with vision impairment in their spaces might be problematic. So do we really want, so I'll get things like, well, what if there's a hole in the pavement and the person with the cane falls into it? But like, yes, what are you doing about that? Like, it's not, but it's like this, well, if they will just go away and leave us alone, then we don't have to worry about them. So we don't build ramps so that those people that are in wheelchairs that are incredibly annoying, and they're not that many of them anyway, but they don't have to come and visit us. So it's it's a tricky conversation to have with people sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I add something to that? Sorry, Holly. Thanks, Anna. I wanted to share that unless you experience, we were talking the other day about being less than a white cis straight male as a comparison point. Unless you have experienced a form of exclusion, it's very hard to know how it feels. It's nasty. It's, I don't belong in this community. I have to create something else for myself where I fit. And the choices that we make around language, place, the decisions that are made in the workplace, you know, how meetings happen, all those things make a difference. They make a huge difference. I was on a call, a space call last week, actually, talking about how important it is, a tiny thing, to put up a rainbow flag in your cafe. It means immediately I'm safe there. I know I can go in there and I can feel safe. And it is not like that in all places. So I guess I want to convey to everybody that small gestures or big gestures you might be talking about, Anna, really make a difference to creating community so that we can all feel like we belong here. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that point around the fact that really there is no such thing as a small gesture, like everything is significant, and you sometimes underestimate the significance of what you perceive to be a little thing in terms of how that's landed and received at the end of someone else. And it was striking me when you were talking about cost, it's an interesting mindset to try and get your head around too, because how are we equating cost if that's the way that we're thinking about the decision to not do something? Like, I just think about how poor we are, for example, at thinking about well-being and mental health costs and factoring in what exclusion and isolation and disconnect cost us, and how much a better job we have to do of trying to find a way, if this is the mindset we're still going to have to engage in selling business cases, to be able to think about how we frame this up as part of the conversation, because right now, by virtue of the fact that we can't, it's not included, and therefore we're not looking at a holistic picture. I want to come to a question that's come in from Amanda that I think is a really interesting one. Just saying, do you think remote working and this whole pandemic pivot that we've had to do this year, is the new normal going to be positive or assistive with kind of diversity, inclusion, culture, or do you worry that it might actually take us more in the other direction? Happy for anyone who'd like to have a stab at that to jump in. Anna, your hand.
Well, from my perspective, when I'm talking to people with vision impairment, they point out the fact that now that since we've been in isolation, that we've all been able to experience a little bit of what they face every single day, in that they can't go out because the buses aren't accessible or they can't. So I'm hoping that it will mean that we're a little bit more empathetic. We've had a little bit more soul searching. And I hope that the new normal is a little bit more reflective and thinking about others and not just about ourselves, and the chasing of the almighty dollar in those business cases we're always having to put forward.
I love that. Other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm a mixture in terms of the positiveness around the environment. It's certainly espoused a whole new way of thinking. And I think it's also, for me, what it's given a lot of humanity is time out. It kind of pressed the stop or pause button on some people's lives that was so busy. I mean, one of the positive conversations you get is, I've spent more time with my kids. I actually, have spent more time in my house. So, you have people who've built these fantastic places to live in, but they're never there because they're jet setting, traveling all around the world. And I think it's also opened people's eyes to the different opportunities that are there if you change the way you think. If you're forced to change the way you do business ordinarily, you will come up with a different solution. And I think, I noticed in the chat people are mentioning the fact that the D&I business case has been, talked about, exhausted, but there's been very little actual physical investment into it. And that's why the needle has so moved. And I think one of the first things that I said initially was, well, why is it's not that hard? It's really not that hard what we're talking about. And one of the challenges that I found, particularly from cultural diversity in Australia, is that culture is then seen as one, which is just looking at the solutions and the issues around Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander communities, which is huge in and of itself. and completely something that, you know, I am not in any position or any way trying to comment on. But what I'm trying to say is when you use that word culture and you try to bring the multicultural community and you look at what's been done in that space, it's almost next to nothing, really.
No, absolutely. Nicole, anything to add?
Not in particular. I think it's nice that people have their dogs barking and their kids crying, and I think this is a real world, and you know where we're whole humans. This is what we bring to our workspace, so that's a positive thing. But I think there are real significant downsides about not coming together as well.
I'm going to come to a question from Moira, who's been the champion that's been posting links to everyone's websites and everything while you've all been talking. So thank you, Moira, for doing all that in the background. Much appreciated. Her question is, what would you like to see more of in SheEO to increase inclusion? And we might expand that out in terms of any comments for just communities you're involved in. What can we be more mindful of doing in order to increase inclusion? Again, happy for whoever'd like to start to kick us off.
I can get us started if you like. I think SheEO does a fantastic job in creating space for belonging. And a reason that comes to mind for that is the willingness to go towards discomfort. So I think that is really important. It's not simple. What we're saying, it's not hard to do, but the journey internally is challenging and confronting. I think for an organisation to be really committed to diversity, inclusion and belonging, you have to be willing to get uncomfortable. And I have really adored that leadership in SheEO and the ability to address issues immediately rather than letting them sit for a long time or even becoming a practice before it's responded to or people are able to share their honest opinions about that. So I'd say finding the edge and bringing that to the centre is a real quality of SheEO and something I'd love to see more broadly.
Well, I hope someone's tweeting that, finding the edge and bringing that to the centre. I love that. Excellent. Other thoughts? Anyone got anything to add?
No, I think Nick took a lot of my work.
Okay, I'm going to come to our next question, which is from Gail. What have you found effective in having someone, such a leader of the majority specifically, understand why this requires urgent attention? So how have you gotten cut through when so often it's so easy to feel like you're banging your head against a brick wall? Any advice or insights?
Yeah, I would say, despite that business case that I keep getting asked about, there are things like you don't know what you don't know. And so often when I am talking to people, like what we talked about before, is how does the person who's blind find the Braille sign? And suddenly the light bulb goes off and they go, oh my, I've never thought about that. So I think that's a really important thing to bear in mind. And I think we've covered this before in that people don't want to do the wrong thing. Like Christine said, that, everybody in their own hearts is trying the best that they can. So it's just about gently introducing people to different things. And then on inclusion, where we talk about, there's been comments that the case for D&I has been done to death. I don't think that people, I think there's still contribution that can be made there. So earlier we had a chat and I explained that I have a friend who works for NASA. He's completely blind and he works for NASA identifying new planets and new stars from sound waves. So you just go mind blowing, like what other things can we do and what other world problems could we solve if we bring in these other skills that we don't necessarily even know that people have until you start talking to them and they go, well, did you know that planets make noise? It's like, no, I did not know that. But my 12-year-old had a great time Googling all of that. And it's really interesting.
Yeah, I think just to add to what Anna said, I think because we all come from, I guess, our own biases and our own understanding of what is important, what is a priority, what are our values. I think for me, working with leaders who, first of all, finding some common ground, because I find a lot of the time people don't want to have an uncomfortable conversation. Like for me, particularly for me, if the word race then gets thrown in there, just as a word, you can see immediately the energy shift and the uncomfortableness that is, and everybody scrambling to justify how they're not that, how they're not this, how they're not that my voice ends up not even being heard, like because we're so busy trying to defend ourselves, we can't find that common ground, which is the humanity ground, and which is why I keep saying this is not hard. Like, we are the human race. We are different. We've known this. Like, this didn't just spring up on us. Like, it's kind of like people are thinking, well, this diversity thing just sprung up on us. Like, we've always been different, and none of us want to be the same. We want that difference, and we know that we want that. So why then can we not find some level of common ground to start having conversations about maybe firstly the things we agree on? Let's just start there. Let's put into one basket the things we disagree on, but let's start on the things we agree on. And you'll find that in 9 times out of 10, there's more that we agree on than we disagree on. But what gets magnified is the things that we disagree on. So the leaders that I find that are really engaging in these conversations are leaders who can, first of all, let go of their ego. A lot of them are usually female, and they usually have some experience themselves of what it's like to be treated, inequitably. As Nicole has said, if you've never experienced in your life personally what it's like to be discriminated against, it is really a theoretical exercise. If you've never yourself explained, and I don't mean that in any disrespect, please don't take it in that way. What I'm saying is that if you don't have an innate understanding, like where I come from, for example, I'll give you a simple example. My great aunt cried when she saw that my nanny was white. And she cried because never in her life could she imagine that her great niece could employ a white person to work in her home to clean and look after her children. Because I couldn't even understand why she was crying when she was looking at photos I'm like, what's wrong? Why are you crying? She's like, who's this person? And I said to her, that's, my son's nanny. And I just said it kind of casually. And then I turned around, like, why is this woman crying? And for her, because she had been raised and told and led to believe that all you can ever be is a domestic subservient person to somebody else, simply because of something that you did nothing to create, just how you look like. You carry that in you. And how that person approaches these kinds of conversations, the empathy that you bring to it, the understanding that you bring to it, to this and any other inequality, you have that affinity. Whereas if you're coming from the space of you've never experienced that in any form, either from a disability, from your sexual orientation, whichever way you look at it, it sometimes doesn't give you that added level of empathy, because that has to be learned empathy. As opposed to lived empathy, which is what I was trying to explain.
Yeah, really powerful. Nicole, I can see you reacting. Did you want to share what that's brought up for you, or how any of your thoughts on this topic?
I just really encourage people to be, it's just reiterating what I said before, to be willing to be uncomfortable. And we're not always going to get it right, but that we have to try. There isn't really an alternative. We've really got to give it a crack. And I think to find people that care about it and that you can talk to is really important. I mean, even in my social circle, I can't talk about everything that I care about openly, like I might in the SheEO context. But I think find those people so you can strengthen your muscle to be courageous in this space, and to stand up for yourself and for others when it happens, being able to do that in the moment. I'm really conscious of running out of time, so I'm going to leave it there.
Well, fantastic closing thought in terms of leaning into discomfort and being prepared to go to that edge and experience that as part of that. Even if you haven't lived the empathy, you can learn the empathy, and that's part of the progression every single one of us can commit to taking. Christine and Anna, we've got probably about 90 seconds to go. Can I come to each of you for just a closing takeaway you'd like to leave our audience with?
I think for me,
I really. You go, Christine.
Now we're both going to back off. 90 seconds. So I think for me, the takeaway would be for me, it's not hard. The diversity and inclusion, it's not hard to include your fellow human. It's the human thing to do, and we all have humanity at our core. So my core takeaway for everybody is this is not hard for you to do. There's some small, meaningful things that you can do on a day-to-day basis, and the crux of it is this is not even something we need to learn. This is something that I think innately all of us actually know. It's about acknowledging that and then acting on that.
Love that. Anna, bring us home. 30 seconds.
Just to summarize what the others have said, lean in, ask those difficult questions, but commit to it. Like, go and talk to somebody that is different to you and hear their stories. I think that's a good place to start.